Good morning. This is Ron. It is Friday, August the 3rd. Welcome to Story Time. And thank you, thank you, thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. And speaking to all you butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So you hear people call the radio stations, Rush Limbaugh et al., and say that they don't see much of a difference between the Republican and the Democrat parties. The hosts always resist this. Oh no, that's not true. We're miles apart. We're vastly different in our outlooks and our philosophies, et cetera, et cetera. And but it is true that the Republican Party, as it stands now, is really become nothing more than the Republican wing of the Democrat Party. And because again, the Democrats have run the program. They have the ones that have decided what politics is all about. They've decided how political campaigns should be run and what the issues are. And the Republicans have just basically meekly gone along with the program and haven't stood up and asserted themselves in any way, shape, or form. And so what a lot of what has happened to Republicans is that in very subtle ways, a lot of the values that Republicans have and have had, because basically the left is anti-value. The left wants change. They want radical change. They want revolutionary change. And it's much easier to encourage or incite revolution, rebellion, civil war, riots, etc., with a society in which there are very few values, or at least no values that are adhered to. Than a society that does have values. So, how do you strip a country of its values? Well, one of the ways that they have done that is in the case of we used to have something that was called the stupid question, and that was when you were growing up, you knew that before you asked a question, you thought about it. Is this a question I really want to ask? Whether you're asking your teacher, you're asking your parents, or you're asking whoever it is, you thought about it for a second because there was always the possibility if you asked a stupid question, you'd be told that's a stupid question, and whoever you're asking it of would refuse to answer it. So the left doesn't like that because one of the things it does, it takes away power from news people. As an example, news people then now can ask anything, I mean, just, and I've listened to news conferences in which the newscasters ask the stupidest of stupid questions, and a lot of times it's done. Stupid questions are asked to punish whoever it is that they are asking the questions of, whether it's president or a member of Congress. And they ask the stupid questions as a sort of a form of harassment, but to punish and shape the opinion of that person and to get them to change their mind about what it is that they're doing, whatever the reporters are asking about. So they'll ask the stupid question, and now it is no longer permissible or socially acceptable to say it's a stupid question. And that's one of the things that the Republicans need to do is bring it back. Go back to the stupid question and go back to saying that's a stupid question, I'm not going to answer it. But it was taken away. They did it the first way they did it was with kids. And what they did is they said, how dare anyone tell a child that they're asking a stupid question? Then you're discouraging that child because they use basically determinism. You're forcing the child to not ask questions, to be silent, and to not learn anything. The child no longer has any interest in learning. The child then goes ahead and becomes a delinquent and goes on to lead a life of crime, and everybody lives unhappily ever after. And determinism is dead. no such thing occurs. What you're doing is you're simply teaching the child that yes, there are smart questions and there are stupid questions. Don't ask the stupid questions, ask the smart ones. Then the stupid questions are the ones that you either know the answer to or you could figure them out on your own pretty easily. The smart questions, of course, are the ones that where you need where the person you're asking them of is the only one that really has the information, or where you're in a position where you're really confused about where to go to find that information, and the person you're asking can provide you with that direction. So asking stupid questions might be asking, what day is it? What time is it? You know, and a lot of times to be polite, we'll go along with it. What time is it? It's time to get a watch. You know, check your cell phone, whatever. And so that's a stupid question. Sometimes people will ask stupid questions, again, with a purpose. Kids do it to get attention and to make people laugh. They think it's funny to ask a stupid question. When the teacher says, "Are there any questions?" Yeah, what day is today? Where's the restroom? And another stupid question is asking a question that has nothing to do with the subject at hand. You know, so, and again, the purpose is to gain attention, to get some laughs, and or to put somebody under pressure. Because if you're having a press conference and you're getting peppered with stupid questions, it gets frustrating and demoralizing, and you want to shut things down and walk away. So, but in any case, they started with the kids and make people feel guilty about saying that's a stupid question. So now we suffer the consequences for it, all of us, not only the politicians that are getting peppered with stupid questions, but those of us that are looking to the news reporters to provide us with actual news. And it needs to come back. The Republicans need to bring back the stupid question, and so and also you hear on the radio so that people will call up and say, you know what the problem is with the Republican Party is that the Republican Party follows the rules. The Democrats don't follow the rules, and so they are able to get away with things that the Republicans can't get away with. And so we should ape the Democrats, do as they do, and throw the rules out the window. Well, that's ridiculous. Again, you're putting yourself in a position there where you again become the Republican wing of the Democrat Party. Why do we want to ape our political adversaries, the people that we believe are doing this country harm? We don't. We have. It's ridiculous. It's also what you'll hear from the pundits, the talk show hosts, is this kind of jealousy thing where the left will do something and the right will say, well, if we did that, we'd get in trouble. How come the left get away with it? How come nobody in the news departments complain about the left doing XYZ, saying this, acting racist, whatever the case may be? And again, then you're simply putting yourself in the position of being, of sounding like you're jealous. Gee, I wish I could be a Democrat. Then I could get away with being a racist, a misogynist, a homophobe. And that looking at things not in terms of right and wrong, is it right to be a misogynist? Is it right to be a homophobe? Is it right to be a racist? No, it's not. That's the point. And so what they should be saying, and what people used to say, again, going back several decades, was something to the effect of, look at this Democrat doing XYZ. No Republican would ever do such a thing. And no Republican would ever do such a thing because no other Republicans would have him around. And they wouldn't do such a thing because we have standards, we have values, and we're not going to just simply associate with anybody. Not just anybody can be a member of the Republican Party or can be a conservative. Now you're creating a value base and you're creating a separation between the parties. The Democrats are on one side where they are basically wanton and immoral, and you have the Republicans on the other side that are standing up for values and making the tough calls. And that the Republican Party is a better quality party than the Democrat Party is, and is therefore worth being a part of. Otherwise, again, all you end up being is it all kind of amalgamates into one blob, amorphous blob of political party. A Democrat, Republican is it all becomes kind of the same thing, and that's more or less what the left wants, anyhow. One single party moving in a particular direction to marching towards socialist paradise. So, because that's what, always what the left is looking for. And again, that's where the Republicans are making the mistakes. It is not the left that is so powerful that they are able to change our society. The only reason the left has any efficacy or effectiveness at all in our society is because of the cravenness, the stupidity, the ignorance, and the ineptitude of conservatives. And it is long past time for conservatives to be concerned with the quality of what it is that they talk about, of what it is that they say, and what it is that they promote. Stop and think about what you're going to say before you say it. And I think that because the Republicans, I believe, could shut down socialism in this country almost overnight simply by standing their ground and refusing to allow the left to run the show. Stand your ground. 99% of the time is all you need to do as an individual. If you're beset by lefties in your life, whether it's family members or coworkers, simply standing your ground has a dramatic effect on these lefties. You don't have to convince them of anything. They have to convince you. And simply by standing your ground and refusing to be intimidated, bullied, or manipulated, you shut them down. They've got nothing. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the Playboy interview with Ayn Rand from 1964. Thank you very much. And so I'm going to be reading here, picking up where I left off on the Ayn Rand interview from Playboy from 1964. And I like to read these interviews because they're informative. You learn the little tricks that the left likes to use in terms of manipulating, bullying, and intimidating people. It's also a good way to get to know better Rush Limbaugh, Ayn Rand, etc., about what their philosophy is, their philosophical theories, let's put it that way, and political ideas, socio-political ideas. So, Playboy, would you say that you are the last of the romanticists? Rand, or the first of their return, to quote one of my characters in Atlas Shrugged. Playboy, what is your appraisal of contemporary literature in general? Rand, philosophically, immoral. Aesthetically, it bores me to death. It is degenerating into a sewer devoted exclusively to studies of depravity, and there's nothing as boring as depravity. Playboy, are there any novelists whom you admire? Rand, yes, Victor Hugo. Playboy, what about modern novelists? Rand, no, there's no one that I could say I admire among the so-called serious writers. I prefer the popular literature of today, which is today's remnant of romanticism. My favorite is Mickey Spillane. Playboy, why do you like him? Rand, because he is primarily a moralist. In a primitive form, the form of a detective novel, he presents the conflict of good and evil in terms of black and white. He does not present a nasty gray mixture of indistinguishable scoundrels on both sides. He presents an uncompromising conflict. As a writer, he is brilliantly expert at the aspect of literature which I consider most important, plot structure. Playboy, what do you think of Faulkner? Rand, not very much. He's a good stylist, but practically unreadable in content, so I've read very little of him. Playboy, what about Nabokov? Rand, I've read only one book of his and a half. The half was Lolita, which I couldn't finish. He's a brilliant stylist. He writes beautifully, but his subjects, his sense of life, his view of man are so evil that no matter amount of artistic skill can justify them. Playboy, as a novelist, do you regard philosophy as the primary purpose of your writing? Rand, no. My primary purpose is the projection of an ideal man, of man as he might be and ought to be. Philosophy is the necessary means to that end. Playboy, in your early novel, Anthem, your protagonist declares, "It is my will which chooses, and the choice of my will is the only edict I respect." Isn't this anarchism? Is one's own desire or the will the only law one must respect? And again, up until now, the other questions were straightforward and were in good faith. Is this? Does that? Do you think? Now we start getting where they're asking a question that is trying to lead somewhere, lead to a particular preconceived conclusion by asking, isn't it? Isn't this anarchism? Rand, not one's own will. This is, more or less, a poetic expression made clear by the total context of the story and Anthem, one's own rational judgment. You see, I use the term free will in a totally different sense from the one usually attached to it. Free will consists of man's ability to think or not to think. The act of thinking is man's primary act of choice. A rational man will never be guided by desires or whims, only by values based on his rational judgment. That is the only authority he can recognize. This does not mean anarchy, because if a man wants to live in a free, civilized society, he would, in reason, have to choose to observe the laws, when those laws are objective, rational, and valid. I've written an article on this subject for the Objectivist newsletter on the need and proper function of a government. Playboy, what in your view is the proper function of a government? Rand, basically there is really only one proper function, the protection of individual rights. Since rights can be violated only by physical force and by certain derivatives of physical force, the proper function of government is to protect men from those who initiate the use of physical force, from those who are criminals. Force in a free society may be used only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. This is the proper task of government, to serve as a policeman who protects men from the use of force. Playboy, if force may be used only in retaliation against force, does the government have the right to use force to collect taxes, for example, or to draft soldiers? Rand, in principle, I believe that taxation should be voluntary, like everything else, but how one would implement this is a very complex question. I can only suggest certain methods, but I would not attempt to insist on them as a definitive answer. So she goes on here, giving some examples of government lottery, and let's see, and talks about the draft. She feels it's improper and unconstitutional. But anyways, the point is that this is where Playboy has stumbled onto the weakness of her argument, or having her objectivist philosophy, and is exposing it right here with this question about the use of force. And because she has her own philosophy, she now becomes not realistic, but idealistic. And so idealism is actually means that you're going to have to use, you have to either be irrelevant or use force in order to get your ideals achieved. But anyways, she says, in principle, I believe taxation should be voluntary like everything else. But how one would implement this is a very complex suggestion. So she's projecting an ideal. In an ideal world, yes, taxation would be voluntary. Everybody would pay their fair share, and we wouldn't even need the IRS, because everybody would do it voluntarily. And there you go. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a real world, and the realistic world. And the realistic world, we make the presumption for the status quo, and we don't make the presumption for change. We don't make the presumption for the ideal. In the real world, we have taxes, and we have an organization that is organizations, but federally speaking, one organization, the IRS, that is entrusted with enforcing tax laws and making sure that the taxes that are owed get collected. And that's where you start any argument or discussion about taxes has to start with the status quo. We have an IRS, we have a tax system. Okay, now we can talk about abolishing income taxes. We can talk about abolishing various types of taxes, or abolishing or changing the um, organization that is used to collect those taxes. In this particular case, the IRS. But what we're not going to talk about is whether or not taxes should or should not be voluntary. Uh, uh, they're mandatory, and the only reason we would discuss changing a mandatory is if there is a prima facie case for change. If there's an obvious reason why taxes shouldn't be mandatory, then we can have that discussion. And I don't see that that's ever going to happen. I don't see that there's. Do we need taxes to get things done, to fund a military, to pave the roads, etc.? Of course we do. So why would we have them be optional? Why would we say to people, pay the taxes if you feel like it? And if you don't feel like it, because that's what voluntary means. Hey, I was going to pay my taxes this month, but I'd rather go ahead and get my kids enrolled in soccer, or I'd rather buy myself another car, that kind of thing. And if you have that kind of a situation, it seems to me that you're never going to get anything. That government ceases to have a role, because she once, on the one hand, says government has the role of protecting people's rights. Well, how's the government going to do that? If the government's going to be the policeman, the government has to have the money necessary to be able to create the organizations and the structure to be able to go ahead and protect people's rights, to be effective. And so the way we do that is with taxes. There is no other way. And I guess that would be the prima facie case for change, is if there ever becomes another way that maybe through technology. I can't even see that, because it's really not even a technological issue, but we make the presumption for the status quo, and so if anybody that wants to change it, the burden of proof is on them. Okay, we have taxes that need to be collected. It's mandatory for them to be collected. We can have debates and discussions all day long about the tax rates, who pays what the taxes are going to be used for. But the idea that we're going to have, and as a matter of fact, there's no such thing as voluntary taxes anyways. It's a contradiction in terms. Taxes are mandatory, period. If it's you're doing something voluntary, then it's like you're doing something more along the lines of paying dues. Like this becomes a club. But the problem with that is that if you quit paying the dues, you're out of the club, aren't you? And if you're out of the club, then your rights should be able to be violated, your God-given rights, because you're no longer in the club. And none of that makes any sense. Government is put on the earth in order to secure people's rights, and so therefore everybody has to pay into the system. And the way to do that, you can't have it voluntary. The government can't voluntarily enforce or protect people's rights, and people cannot voluntarily fund the government. Government has a mandatory job to do, and the people have to pay it, and use a mandatory and involuntary, coercive process to do it. I mean, there is no other way. So, but again, she starts with the presumption when she creates objectivism, she ceases to be objective. She becomes subjective and idealistic. She's now working towards creating an ideal society. And in that respect, she becomes no different than socialists, because that's what socialism is trying to create an ideal society, socialist paradise. Okay, so she goes on to say, a government lottery, for instance, used in many countries in Europe, is one good method of voluntary taxation. And again, she contradicts herself. There's no such thing. There are others. Taxes should be voluntary contributions for the proper governmental services which people do need and therefore would be and should be willing to pay for. But again, you can't, we're getting into a contradiction. You can't have voluntary mixed with, on the other hand, we must have mandatory. The government's job is to mandatory to protect my rights, but I'll voluntarily provide money to help it do its job. That's not going to work. As they pay for insurance. But of course, this is a problem for a distant future, for the time when men will establish a fully free social system. Here we go. So now she's getting to the point where she admits that her objectivism is idealistic, and that it's not, there's no way to make this into reality today. It's going to have to be put off into sometime in the foreseeable or not so foreseeable future. It would be the last, not the first, reform to advocate. As to the draft, it is improper and unconstitutional. It's a violation of fundamental rights, of a man's right to his own life. No man has the right to send another man to fight and die for the sender's cause. Country has no right to force men into involuntary servitude. Armies should be strictly voluntary, and as military authorities will tell you, volunteer armies are the best armies. But again, it's the same thing with taxes. Should there be a draft? Absolutely, for the same reason that the military is there as a policing agency. It is there to make sure that our God-given rights are secured, and we don't get any, there's no optional there. That's what its basic job. Now, we can have arguments about whether or not the military is being used properly. I think the founders in this country have always looked at the idea of the military in the United States being something that is going to be strictly within the boundaries of our country. That we're not going to have, as we do today, bases overseas and force projection and all this kind of thing, and that we're going to have these global strategic ideas of in the Vietnam War. There was the domino theory. If the United States allows Vietnam to go communist, then all the countries around it will then end up going communist. So therefore, we must send troops to Vietnam. But they encouraged, and also that we're not going to have a large standing army. The whole idea was to keep things for the army small. So also that way you're not going to end up, or less likely end up, with a situation where the political parties use the military as a way of oppressing their own citizens. So we've gotten way, way away from that. But in terms of its proper use, and again, there can always be debates about whether or not the military is being used properly, but in terms of its proper use, there has to be a mechanism to force people to serve and to serve in the military. Doing it on a strictly voluntary basis just makes absolutely intellectually no sense whatsoever. It's just contradictory. What about other public needs? Do you consider the post office, for example, a legitimate function of government? Now, let's get this straight. My position is fully consistent. Not only the post office, but streets, roads, and above all, schools should be privately owned and privately run. And again, she's going back into being idealistic about things. I advocate the separation of state and economics. The government should be concerned only with those issues which involve the use of force. This means the police, the armed services, and the law courts to settle disputes among men. Nothing else. Everything else should be privately run and would be much better run. So again, we go right back to being idealistic and not realistic. And part of the problem with being idealistic is that what you end up with is a situation where, as a socio-political party, you end up with a choice, like the libertarians are facing now. Libertarians are not a force in American politics because they're unrealistic. Neither is really the Socialist Party or any other idealistic political parties. But the libertarians have a particularly nasty situation that they face in terms of a conflict or contradiction, or perhaps irony would be the best word to use for it, in that libertarians advocate no use of force. You should not initiate the use of force among individuals or groups of individuals. that force should only be used in retaliation for the unjustified use of force. The problem is in trying to create this kind of a society, a perfect and an ideal society, you're going to have to use force in order to do it. And or, as the Libertarian Party is now, is be politically irrelevant. Okay. That's all there is to it. It's the same thing with socialism. Socialism has the same issues, where it can either use force to try to create the ideal society, or it can be rather inert and irrelevant, as do any other idealistic philosophies, such as Ayn Rand's. The same thing with the objectivism, that in order for them to be able to make their create the ideal society as they see it, they're going to have to initiate the use of force or remain political eunuchs for all eternity. Would you create any new government agencies, new government departments or agencies? No, and I truly cannot discuss things that way. I'm not a government planner, nor do I spend my time inventing utopias, but actually she does. See, that's the problem here. She thinks that objectivism is realistic. It isn't. It's idealistic. It's utopia-oriented, period. And so I'm talking about principles whose practical applications are clear. If I have said that I am opposed to the initiation of force, what else has to be discussed? Playboy, what about force in foreign policy? You have said that any free nation had the right to invade Nazi Germany during World War II. Rand, certainly. Playboy, and that any free nation today has the moral right, though not the duty, to invade Soviet Russia, Cuba, or any other slave pen. Correct? Rand, correct. A dictatorship, a country that violates the rights of its own citizens, is an outlaw and can claim no rights. Would you actively advocate the United States invade Cuba or the Soviet Union? Rand, not at present. I don't think it's necessary. I would advocate that which the Soviet Union fears above all else, economic boycott. I would advocate a blockade of Cuba, an economic boycott of Soviet Russia, and you see both of those regimes collapse without the loss of a single American life. So that's an interesting point where she is basically saying that they have the United States has the right to invade another country, not a duty to do so, but has the right to do it. And I haven't thought about that. Again, it seems to me that it kind of smacks of idealism. Ostensibly, we would be invading this country not simply to remove its current government, but to replace it with an idealistic form of government that would do things basically Ayn Rand's way. So I don't think so. I don't think that's that we have the right to do that at all. No, off the top of my head, but I have to think about that a little bit further. In any case, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there, and we'll pick up with Ayn Rand again next week. And so coming up here in a minute, I'm going to do a few jokes from the Cab Driver's Joke Book. And thank you very much. And the New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book by Jim Peach. Jim Peach, a real New York City cabbie, has heard them all, from business people, unemployed laborers, Wall Street lawyers, prostitutes, writers, tourists, drug dealers, and lovers, all from the back seat of his cab as he makes his way around New York City. Jim always asks his customers for their best jokes, and here are his favorites. More than 400 clean jokes, dirty jokes, ethnic jokes, religious jokes, dirty Ernie jokes, jokes about musicians, bartenders, hookers, everyone. The New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book also includes true stories about Jim's writers and original illustrations by Jim himself, the cabbie with the best collection of jokes in New York City. A Jewish man walks home every day past a pat shop. Each day he passes, he hears Hebrew singing coming from a parrot in the store. It sounds so beautiful that he feels happy for the rest of his walk home. One day he decides that it would be really wonderful to have that beautiful singing fill his house. So he goes into the pet shop, buys the parrot, and takes it home. The parrot sings him a Jewish prayer before dinner, and the man is very happy. It goes on like this for a few weeks, the bird singing happily for the man whenever he's home. Upon the arrival of the Jewish high holy days, the man decides to take the bird with him to the temple. He makes the bird a little yarmulke and then walks happily to the temple. As he enters with the parrot on his shoulder, his friend sees him. "What, Moishe, you're bringing a bird here to the temple? But it's Rosh Hashanah." So the man replies, "Wait till you hear this bird. He knows Hebrew and can sing all the prayers." "That's impossible. I don't believe you," says the friend. "You don't believe me," says the man. $50 says the bird can sing the prayers. "You got a bet," says the friend, and pulls out his money. The other men notice this, and pretty soon everyone is involved. Suddenly the man finds himself having bet $1,000. He turns to the bird and says, "Okay, bird, let's hear it." But the bird just sits there. The man pleads, "Sing! Oh, please, sing!" But the bird is silent. The rabbi says, "Time for the service." And Moishe loses the bet. Walking home, Moishe is fuming. "Boy, $1,000. You sing every day. Why couldn't you at least have sung one little prayer?" He gets home and takes out a knife. He starts sharpening it and says, "Okay, bird, I'm going to have me $1,000 parrot sandwich." "Wait," says the bird. "Wait for what?" says Moishe. "Wait till Yom Kippur," says the parrot. "We'll get 10-to-1 odds." Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother is lying in her bed when the wolf bursts in through her door. "Give me all your money," he demands, snarling and showing his teeth. "Oh, no, you don't," says the grandmother, pulling a revolver out from under the covers and training it on the wolf. "You're going to eat me, like it says in the book." And on that note, we conclude another episode of Story Time. And until next time, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.